I'm Al Filreis, and this is PoemTalk at the Writer's House, where I have the pleasure of convening three friends in the world of poetry and poetics to collaborate on a close but not too close reading of some poems. We'll talk, maybe even disagree a bit, and perhaps open up the verse to a few new possibilities, and we hope gain for some poems that interest us, some new readers and listeners. And I say listeners because PoemTalk poems are available in recordings made by the poets themselves as part of our Pen Sound archive, writing.upenn.edu/pensound. Today, I'm joined here in Philadelphia, in person, at the Kelly Writers House in our Arts Cafe by Bethany Swan, a doctoral student here at Penn who focuses on Asian American studies and contemporary poetry and poetics, who has been a Kundiman Fellow and a regional co-chair of Kundiman Northeast, and who is author of the chapbook Diadem Me, published by Meal Press. And by Henry Steinberg, who has done work as a letterpress artisan and in web design development, a longtime Philadelphian, born and raised, and a dear, dear friend of the Kelly Writers House community, going back to his days as a student, when he called this very house his home away from home. And by Caroline Bergvall, the award-winning poet and sound artist who works internationally across various art forms and languages, old, new, quasi-translated, and convergent. I added the convergent in there, but I think it's accurate. Whose books include Fig, Metal English, Drift, and Allison Sings, among others, and whose text and sound works include Via, Half Villa, Ambient Fish, and many others, and whose installations include Say Parsley, and who is here, wrapping up, as of this conversation, having traveled from London during a stay as Kelly Writers House Fellow. Caroline, thank you for this big trip.
Oh, thank you.
So glad that you joined us.
Wonderful to be here.
Yeah, so it's a big pond to cross over when you've been used to Zoom.
That's true. It's good to regain some of the habit, though. Yeah, traveling is lovely.
Good habit.
Yeah,
so it's great. And I just want to say that for people listening to this poem talk or watching the video of it, by the time you see it, we will have posted a number of things from Caroline's visit here, a reading and also a conversation interview. Bethany, first time on Poem Talk?
It is, yes. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you for doing it. Does it take a little bit of nerve to do this? Probably not, right? You're relaxed.
I am much more of a on-the-page poet than a kind of like stage presence. So
Okay.
This is new for me, but
All
I'm
right.
excited.
All right.
I like
no,
conversation.
you're already a hit. This is good. Thank you so much. And Henry, we just remembered before we started recording that this is your second Poem Talk, but the first one was in the dim, dark days of undergraduate. So
Yeah, it was nearly a decade ago.
Poem Talk's been going
Yeah.
on a long time.
Because it was at the earliest or most recent 2013. It could have been even
Yeah,
2012.
it was early, and it was about Charles Reznikoff, and we didn't even have a studio then.
No,
We were in my office recording. So anyway, it's great to have you back. It's good to see you.
it's wonderful to be back.
Thank you, Henry. The four of us have gathered here today to talk about four poems that we've selected from Sawako Nakayasu's book titled Some Girls Walk into the Country They Are From, published in 2020 by Wave Books. The four poems we will discuss. This is for those following along who have a copy of the book. They are, first, Girl A's Peanuts and Girl D's Mouthful. That's one poem. The second one is Gun. The third is called Girl in a Field of Flowers. And the fourth is 10 Girls in a Bag of Potato Chips. And this last poem, 10 Girls, is also presented in the book in a French translation by Genevieve Chow and a Japanese translation by Miwako Ozawa. Our recordings were made by Sawako Nakayasu just for Poem Talk, for which we're very grateful. Thank you, Sawako. And we are also pleased to have recordings of French and Japanese translations by Chow and Ozawa. So here now are Nakayasu, first, 4 poems, Chow, the translation into French, and Ozawa into Japanese, performing poems from Some Girls Walk into the Country They Are From.
Girl A's peanuts and Girl D's mouthful. Girl A on the train with peanuts, the expectant fullness of Girl D's mouth, growing distance of the floor. A few bystanders are scraped by peanut shell, but believing themselves innocent, are willing to let peanut scars be peanut scars. How good of them. Girl A soon bereft of all peanuts. Girl D, too, close to the brink. And when it happens, it will not only rain peanuts, but also nails, bones, hair clippings, gavels, hammers, and broken tongue talkers will all come shooting out of her mouth and fall down on everyone, on all of us, inside and outside and throughout the train and the rain and the girls and across the dead oceans, training up for the hard rain, for the new weather, for the new weather. Gun. Girl H says, let's turn ourselves into bullets and load up this gun. Let's nod and pretend you never said that. Come on. That way we can choose where we go and who we hit, and whose flesh we tear apart with impunity and disregard. We can reverse all the injustice by recalibrating who lives and who dies. We'll disrupt the systems through which they determine who is guilty. By turning ourselves into bullets, we'll finally rid ourselves of the baggage of being female. We'll be free. We'll be powerful. We'll burn it all to the ground. You mean like when they firebomb the whole city of Tokyo? No, like when you finish a board game and you start all over. We burn it all down and start again from nothing. We'll get arrested. Bullets don't get arrested. We'll be taken into the labs and analyzed. They will trace our DNA, then rape our mothers. Bullets don't have DNA. Bullets don't have mothers. We'll feel so guilty. Not by the time we are bullets. Bullets don't feel. But what if I do? What if I wuss out and jam the barrel? You don't have control over that. You said we would have control. No, I didn't. We would have control. Just then, a water gun drops down from the ceiling. While the original argument carries on, the rest of the girls go bury their heads in the water. Girl in a field of flowers. Class, what do you see in this painting? Flowers. In the foreground or background? Both. What else? A girl. What else? Clothing. What else? An expanse of space. What else? The field of flowers flattening in the distance. Why is the field of flowers flattening? Because the painting uses one-point perspective. But what flattens them? The limits of the painter's ability to paint in extreme detail. Are the flowers in the distance the only flowers that have been flattened? Yes. No. Then what? Here are some flattened flowers in the foreground. Where? Here, not far from the clothing. What kind of clothing is that? I don't know. What else? It's crumpled. What else? I don't know. What else? It's not being worn. What do you mean? It looks like it has been taken off the body. Of whom? The girl. What makes you say that? Because the girl is naked. Why is the girl naked? Because the painting was made by a man. Are you sure? Yes. Are you sure the girl is naked? Yes. Why? Because her clothing is over there. Where? Over there. Where? Over here on the ground. Where? Over here on the ground where some of the flowers have been flattened. How do you know those are flowers? Because they are the same colors as the flowers that have not been flattened. 10 girls in a bag of potato chips. Fight over who gets which chip, as if there were no more than 10 chips in the bag. There are more than 10 chips in the bag. Girl A assumes that the bigger, the rounder, the better. Girl G believes that the beautiful ones should choose first. Girl C makes a bid for lung capacity. Girl J sees that the sharp edges of the less round, more imperfect chip might come in handy one day. She remains quiet. Girl I says no. Only Girl H takes note of the fact that the crispness of the chips is proof positive that the container, the bag, that they reside in is airtight. Only Girl H has a feeling for her true position within the global economy and food supply chain and how it affects the likely outcome of their collective fate. She has trouble deciding whether to speak, slap, or remain silent.
10 filles dans un paquet de chips se battent pour le droit de choisir son chip, comme s'il n'y avait que 10 chips dans le paquet. Il y a plus de 10 chips dans le paquet. Fille A présuppose que plus c'est gros, plus c'est rond, mieux c'est. Fille G croit que les plus belles devraient avoir le droit de choisir en premier. Fille C tente d'avancer la règle de la capacité pulmonaire totale. Fille J voit que les chips en forme de lame pourraient un jour être utiles. Elle reste silencieuse. Fille I refuse. Seule fille H note que tout reste si croustillant que le récipient, je veux dire le sachet, où elle demeure doit être fermé. Seule fille H est un sens de sa vraie situation dans l'économie globale et la chaîne logistique alimentaire et de comment cela va changer le sort à toutes. Elle a du mal à décider entre parler, gifler ou rester muette.
ポテチの袋の中の10人の女の子。まるで袋の中には10枚のポテチしか入っていないかのように、どのポテチを誰が食べるかで言い争う。袋の中には10枚以上のポテチが入っている。女の子 A は当然より大きくて丸いのがいいと思っている。女の子 G は可愛い子たちが先に選ぶべきだと考えている。女の子 C は肺活量で勝負をつけようとしている。女の子 J はあまり丸くない不完全なポテチのギザギザがいつか役に立つ日が来ると見ているが黙ったままでいる。女の子 I は選ぶのを断る。女の子 H だけが入れ物、つまり彼女たちが入っている袋が密閉されている確たる証拠はポテチのパリパリ具合にあると気づいている。女の子 H だけがグローバル経済と食品業界のサプライチェーンについての自分のはっきりした考えと、そうしたことが今後起こりうる自分たちの未来にどう影響するか感づいている。彼女は話そうか引っ張ったこうか黙ったままでいようか決めかねている。
Bethany, pick a poem. You get to pick a poem. Which should we start with?
That's so hard. I would love to start with Girl in a Field of Flowers on page 112.
Fantastic. Okay. Henry and Caroline, first impressions of that poem, just say anything. Henry first?
Arresting.
Yeah, why?
The cadence of the questions of this presumed sort of instructor, the questions that aren't questions, but actually like declarations, and that sort of call and response as we gradually sort of begin to see how this painting expands, or this picture, this place. I found it really just astonishing.
Fantastic. Caroline, what's your
Yeah,
first
I
response?
agree. For me, the question, what else that you have throughout sort of becomes its own sort of sense of wanting to take the poem and perhaps the viewing of the painting further afield, away from even...
Further afield, as it were.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. So that would be, yeah.
So, Bethany, why'd you pick it?
I'm really interested in the relationship between the instructor and the class and what it says about the kind of power dynamic as it shifts by the end of the poem, where the students are clearly pointing out something the instructor themselves has not necessarily noticed. And I'm really also interested in that word flattening that keeps recurring when it's referring to either flowers or clothing or the body of the woman in the painting.
And the one point perspective itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah, even like the space, the distance, the way that the students at one point shift from saying there to here, and bring there to here in this way that, like to your point about that power dynamic, feels like almost the moment of subversion, of like sort of overtaking the instructor.
I went looking for this painting. That is, I got on Google and I thought, I didn't quite find. I thought this has got to be Wyeth or something like that, but it's not.
I found one for it.
Did you find?
Well, I don't know, but I immediately thought of Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe. Because, and then I went looking for it.
Are there some clothes?
And there's, well, certainly, because you have the two women that are naked, and then you have the men lying around the grass, but also there are flowers to the side, and I was trying to see whether they were crumpled. But I just thought that because they are naked and the clothes is, the clothing is crumpled, and it's such an iconic painting, that's been used and reused also to be looking at naked women and then dressed men, and what is the role of the women there. That it felt for me quite, I don't know, very close in any case for me on reading.
And that would
this
make
one.
sense, because if it's a high school or a freshman art history class
Yeah.
or something, that would be a painting that they would
Absolutely.
look at. So let's each try to characterize the pedagogy here. I'll start, and then we'll go to Bethany. It's faux Socratic. I mean, Socratic is hard enough because it leads you, but pretend, because it actually does. It's not a very wise teacher. The teacher is alleging that they know more than the novice viewers, seers. I'll stop there. Bethany, what kind of pedagogy is this? It's not what you aspire to, I imagine.
I really appreciate what Henry just shared about the way that the students are challenging the one-point perspective and bringing that sort of dimensionality back into the view or the frame for the viewers. And it seems that the painting, despite what the students are pointing out, the limitations of the male painter, it seems that those limitations are not inhibiting the students from recognizing the scope, the dimensionality, nor should they prevent us as the readers or listeners from that.
That's great. Henry,
really love
pedagogy?
It's very didactic. It's call and response. It seems as though the instructor assumes that these responses should be given by rote, and that's what makes that turn surprising.
And yet they're supposed to be liberatory. It's like, that's why I said faux Socratic. It's like, I am going to liberate you from seeing what you usually see, and you better do it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Caroline?
I think a lot of it has been said already, but perhaps something to point out is in relation to that teacher who talks about the girl is naked, or doesn't correct, because if you think about paintings, they're not naked, they're nudes. There's often that dimension, and I was really struck by that. So suddenly it's not necessarily a very knowledgeable art history teacher either, because they don't make that distinction. And so I thought that was an interesting aspect of it.
Well, and to that point, I mean, I was thinking a lot about how this almost feels like a parody or a staging of like how the male gaze is taught to students. And that point that Caroline just made about the difference between nudes and naked bodies, and one is sort of like aesthetic and beautiful, and the other is factual and like more vulnerable.
If there were a right-wing art historian, I don't know if there are any, but they would take exception, and probably misreading the tone here, but they would take objection to the idea that the question is asked, why is the girl naked? And the answer seems rote, because the painting was made by a man. Now, either they know that because they have the fact, or they are just like they were taught that this is one-point perspective, which is not the language they would use unless they were force-fed it. So now they are force-fed, seemingly, would say the right-winger. They're just regurgitating a liberal art history that is itself tyrannical. Does that make any sense? So I want to just offer a provocation and see how you all respond to this. It strikes me as art history pedagogy is actually uncomfortably similar to investigating a crime scene. This is like something has happened bad here, and it's almost prosecutorial. It's almost a leading the witness kind of thing. Is that too? Did I go too far? And is it creepy like that? I'm implying it's kind of creepy.
It's sorry.
Go ahead. I was just going to say there's certainly evidence to support that. The evidence of the flattening, the flowers.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. I agree that the vocabulary itself is quite violent in a way with this. Yeah, that's great. I wanted to say that the vocabulary is so imprecise throughout the poem.
Yes.
So I don't even get a sense of art history, if I want to be completely honest, because suddenly the only thing that leads me to it is the word class. And I'm thinking, it's a class of some kind, but there's nothing here that is a little bit of that informational language that you would have in a class where they would indicate, I don't know, they would give you a sense of trying to contextualize it a little bit. Even the word flattened, why is it because it's flattened? Well, why? Because the clothes are crumpled? That is not very precise, that is not, it's hardly descriptive, So.
You're totally right. And it feels very much like there's this presumption of knowledge that like excludes that informational language, that it is I guess to speak to Al's point about the prosecutorial nature, that it's a, what's the word I'm looking for? That it is like a questioning, that these people are being brought in to give interrogation. It's more interrogative, which is even more fascinating that it uses only periods for punctuation.
Absolutely.
And isn't interrogation a word, a term that carries over from teaching and close reading together?
Absolutely.
Right? Don't we interrogate everything?
Yeah.
I mean, where Sawako, the creator of the speaker, stands is a question I'm just going to leave open for a little while and turn to Bethany to pick another poem we can talk about.
Okay. I would love to talk about Gun on 115.
Oh, wow. Okay. Caroline and I kind of prepared for this together in my office upstairs, so I kind of want to turn to Caroline to hear her thoughts on this, because I know this is powerful to you.
Yes, well, first of all, when you indicated that this is a poem that Sawako wrote when she came back from Japan and was sort of shocked to find herself again in a country which has the biggest guns per, in the population in the world, and therefore also is sort of finding herself confronting the emotion that is connected to that constant potential violence. And perhaps the one thing I want to say here is there's a triumphalism that's immediately will be free, will be powerful. And at the same time, there's that very weird brainwashing tone as well throughout. So I found that connection so interesting and so powerful, especially when you look at the stories of gun violence at the moment and police brutality with guns and etc. So.
And it's overtly fallacious. We'll get arrested if we kill people. Bullets don't get arrested. So that's kind of, there's an anti-gun rights activist thing here. Bullets don't get arrested. People get arrested and so forth. It's kind of a perversion of the NRA line. So yes, you're right. Sawako made it clear in her notes that this was written upon relocation to the U.S. from a country, presumably Japan, with an extremely low rate of ownership. So knowing that, Henry, girls and guns with this bravado, it's so disconcerting or maybe darkly comic.
Yeah, I mean, I found it to be extremely powerful, and I was talking to Bethany briefly before the show, like funny. There's so much humor in these poems that feels rooted in the experience of being a woman, of being a girl, and to like see like these, presumably like girl has the connotation of youth, that like these like younger people being imaginative, and their imagination when it's like aimed towards liberation jumps to violence, that like the only way that they can conceive of, or not even they, that girl H specifically can conceive of like sort of transcending her position is like, let's become guns and be bullets. Like if we are the ones that are violence, then we cannot be held to account for that violence.
Might it start with a nod to Dickinson, My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun, where that sort of hard to identify woman speaker.
Yeah.
You can't tell whether she's the gun or the victim or the shooter, I don't think that carries on, but that's an interesting complication.
Yeah, well,
absolutely.
and this, instead of having the sort of like classical, like Dickinsonian, like ellipticalness, is extremely direct. It's let's become guns. It's hortatory, and it's kind of marvelous.
We'll be powerful, girl power.
Exactly.
We got guns.
Yeah.
We're gonna Bethany, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking, I guess, that in the act of turning themselves into guns, they are not only leaving behind the baggage, what is referred to the baggage of being female, but also a matriarchal lineage too. Mothers, bullets don't have mothers, bullets don't have DNA. And so just what does it mean to become an object? And there's a long-standing history in Asian American studies of the objectification of Asian women and the sort of like diminutive references and exoticization of bodies. And so I feel like this is a manifesto that is directly taking up that kind of derogatory stereotype and inversing it. And so I wonder, though, what it does for the girls as they become weapons, as they are bullets. What does it mean not to embody the body of a girl, but to be this kind of like insensate object of destruction?
Can I pause for a meta question for you,
Absolutely.
Bethany? So you mentioned what's happening in Asian American studies and thinking about the figure of the girl, and then of course you also study poetry and poetics. So what's your comment overall? It's a book in which every poem features these algebraically generic girls, right? And how does that connect? And in this one explicitly, she's marking a return from Japan.
So I actually cheated a little. I looked at the press release from Wave Books, and they have this phenomenal kind of definition of the girls as, and this is the quote, "The girls are an unsettling diaspora of poetic form." And so to me, to think about girls as occupying this kind of almost template of anti-form, or how does the idea of diaspora as a scattering, how does that kind of, disrupt what we think about as a logic in form?
Holy cow, I'm so glad. And this is kind of just a little Caroline Bergvall up your alley. So I wonder if you would comment, and then Henry, on this question that Bethany just raised.
I thought that such a powerful and interesting comment. If I take from where you are in relation to the diasporic sort of nearly non-identified but still diasporic girl, and then you look at the girl becoming a bullet, which then is a way of separating from context, separating from lineage, a bit like you were saying. But then the turn of it becomes that it becomes a neutralized, that's why I said brainwashing initially. You become the tool of the state. You sort of, so it's a total brainwashing. You accept a role that you thought you were fighting, initially, and actually you become the bullet that the state wants you to be, which is basically the role of the terrorist, for example, or another extremist position. So there is a blanking out of context and of all the things that might mark them out differently. Yeah, so.
Like a Manchurian candidate turned into a
Absolutely
bullet.
right.
Oh,
yeah,
freaky
exactly
and
right.
scary.
Well,
Exactly.
the way that the state disciplines us into policing ourselves to be its own tool, right? Like there's that sort of Foucauldian idea.
One more question about this one, more of a reference or a footnote, and then Bethany will take us to a third poem since you're on a roll. In the middle of this poem, which marks a reverse course return to a country full of guns, from Japan to the U.S., where the modern relationship dates back to 1945, obviously. This moment where who has the guns and who has the firepower and who is big and mighty and can destroy the most is a big question. And in the middle of this thing, there is the historical marker reference of the firebombing of the city of Tokyo, which was committed by the U.S. preceding the dropping of the atomic bomb. And, Yoko Ono's family fled from that city and was outside. I mean, we have lots of American artists or Asian American artists who have something to say about this. Any of you, why is this marker put into this poem, which is otherwise somewhat strategically bereft of a specific reference like that? Oh boy, I just asked a hard question.
Do you wanna? Is it? I don't know. I'm trying to answer back with a question. Is it that this gun becomes this intense political machine of the American gun, and it's nearly a historical backtracking to what happened with Japan? So it nearly is it's re-acknowledging that event. As she comes back in, she feels the gun again directed against perhaps even her as a, herself as she comes in, but perhaps also further back to Tokyo.
It's a historically tragic irony for the girl, if the girl, yes, it's girl H speaking here, will be free, okay, liberation at the point of a gun, will be powerful, and then we'll burn it all to the ground.
Well, something that I thought was interesting is that there's a rejection of that historical continuity. She's like, no, like when you finish a board game, it's like this exchange.
No, it's not like
see.
that. It's like when
I
you
get
finish a
you.
board.
Okay.
Because
So I misread that,
it's
yeah.
instead of like absorbing or continuing, like it almost feels like it's describing a break from historical trauma that's been replaced by the gun. Like the gun is the gun is the gun. It exists of itself and in itself. It's a game.
It's a game from the start. Let's turn ourselves, and then let's not and say we did, which is a kid's trope.
When
right?
it's almost the way that like the logic of the national response to trauma melts away until it just becomes this lingering violence that isn't about the thing that happened, but it still persists and exists and continues.
But there's also, I think, a danger in the comparison of a board game to the firebombing of Tokyo, because
totally.
there's this idea that in making something that is truly atrocious, and truly the United States was complicit in over 100,000 Japanese civilian deaths in that.
Yeah.
And so the idea that, oh no, it's just like a game or we start over again, I feel like that's intended to be there. Like I think Al's like right in pointing out that there's this very like particular marked specificity in that historical reference that Caroline is saying like it's picked up again in this motif of the gun.
Oh yeah. I mean, I didn't mean to say that it wasn't important. I more meant that I feel like there's an interesting that Sawako is saying something interesting about how children receive like that kind of historical trauma and how they are brainwashed by sort of like statehood and how that interacts with like their desires and their impulses, because you're totally right. I mean, like this feels very much like an indictment of what the US did.
Absolutely.
Also, I feel perhaps I don't see it as young girls necessarily, or they can be, especially because of the way a lot of it is sexualized throughout the book. So I don't see them aged, but I see them as a sort of, it's a female entity. I don't quite know the age, but girl is also a term that's used, by queer women. So, it's sort of, I don't feel that the youth in the same way, but the youth is manifested by the chips, all the objects we have throughout the book, that that the type of life that they seem to have, always these little objects like the water gun here.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to point out those last three lines, because when you say, again, going back to Al's argument, but here while the original argument carries on, now the background of what we've been talking about now, I'm wondering, the original argument for me suddenly, as I hear us, goes back for me to the firebombing of the whole city of Tokyo. So the argument is still happening. It hasn't been digested, neither by this country nor by the other country. And then you bury your head not in the sand but in the water. I mean, there's that sense of, there is a sense of amnesia that happens with that brainwashing as well. The continuing of the supplying of guns to individuals in the way it's happening in this country.
And related in a very simplistic way, relating not simplistic, but basic way, relating to what Sawako and others coming to the United States after a little time away from a country where guns are not an issue, to a country where girls and other children are being killed by proliferated gun ownership, and where nobody feels particularly guilty about it. And we have these specious arguments about guns don't kill people, people do, so leave the guns alone. Guns are free. And to have that, to relocate yourself and to have a culture that doesn't bother with the situation of girls being gunned down, right, and honors I don't know about the Tokyo firebombing. I don't think it was widely known in the U.S. at the time, but certainly the justification for the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs justified on the basis of saving 1 million American lives, and yet tens of thousands of American lives are lost to guns, and that all is just consistent in the discourse. So a basic thing is Sawako gets home and thinks, what the fuck? You know? Anyway, final thoughts on this real quick, and then I want to let Bethany turn us to the third poem. Henry, final thought on this?
I think I'm just like I'm really taken by Caroline's point that like that girl doesn't have to be aged in the way that I think I've been projecting like an idea of like a school-age child onto this notion, but expanding that definition to like include sort of like a femaleness that is like just that isn't specifically youthful, I think has changed my way of reading some of these poems in a way that's really useful.
So a non-age specific
Yeah.
femaleness.
Yeah.
Bethany, final quick thought on this one?
I just think that it brings to mind again the impossibility of having an equilibrium between a just society and a control society. And it's just inevitable violence.
Caroline?
Beautiful. No, I don't. That was a really wonderful point.
Okay, Bethany, the third poem. Which one do you want to do?
Okay, let's do Girl A's Peanuts and Girl D's Mouthful.
Oh my goodness.
Page 48.
I want to say what I think the scene is, and then you can. 'Cause I've read all these poems, and some of them have these scenes. Like there's one called Girl Soup, where she's been shopping with maybe her own kids or some other kids. There, the girls are kids at Target all day, and she writes Girl Soup, and they go to, I assume, a cafeteria at Target. Does Target serve food? I think they probably do. And the girls, they all jump into a soup, and as a way of getting away from Target. Anyway, so here's the scene. I think is here. And I could be wrong. The setting is she or the speaker is traveling, and they're either her girls or other girls are on the train and throwing peanuts at each other, and there's a lot of collateral damage as other passengers are getting popped by peanuts, and this puts her in mind of post nuclear apocalypse via Bob Dylan, and this is like a really interesting strategy for her, as a typical strategy. Let's have some people playing around like girls will do, and let's then imagine what would happen if they were all destroyed by us, by our society. Henry, how did I do?
I think you did pretty well.
So thank you, Henry. I am the host. I have to do at least pretty well.
You did all right.
Okay. Where do we go from there? Is it as striking when we get to not just the peanuts that are raining down from this game on a train, but nails, bones, hair, gavels, hammers, and then other words from Bob Dylan's song, Hard Rain's Gonna Fall?
Sorry. I think it's.
Was there a question in that?
Yeah, I think it's extremely striking, and having listened to the Bob Dylan song just before this, while I was reading the poems preparing for this, it's interesting that song is addressed to a boy, is addressed to a son specifically.
My son, yes.
It's like my son, my son, my son, and the only women,
my darling
in it,
young one.
There's a woman who's on fire and who is dead, and there is a girl who is giving him a rainbow. And this is, this is not that. This is about these young people, these people having fun, doing something really carefree,
making trouble. Yeah, a little bit of trouble.
Making trouble, but I didn't even get the trouble. I got like they're
having
this
fight.
intimate, like fun moment, and it evokes it kind of brings out this like anxiety that I think a lot of society has about young women and about femininity, that like there's like this terror ensconced in like this innocence, and there's like this fear that if young girls are not cared for, they will either be the object of violence or the cause of it. Well
said. Bethany, Caroline?
I guess I'm still thinking about, Caroline, what you said about the girls' portrayal in Gun, and the way that there is some gender fluidity in that, and there's also this kind of question of age and innocence and youth, And I really like, Henry, that you brought up the two images from the Dylan song, the young woman whose body's burning, and then the young girl who offers a rainbow. And so I was thinking, too, about the contrast between like, the distance, just emotively, between those two images of womanhood and girlhood, and then girl A and girl D. And I also wonder, like, what happened to the girls in between A and D, right? So what are those girls doing? But this whole poem is only 7 sentences, and that last sentence is such a culmination, like syntactically, of all of these apocalyptic images. And so you do feel like the weight of the Dylan song and all of those clauses that are like packed with so many adjectives and meaning. And there's a prophetic quality, I think, that carries over to this.
Absolutely. I see that sentence just before it all sort of tips over, the close to the brink. That for me strikes me as that sentence that tips the whole poem over into something much more nearly mythic, you know, where the tone is full of commas, they're no longer short sentences, so commas, so it keeps going, and that sentence grows and grows and grows and ends with the new weather, after dead oceans, after broken tongue talkers, after, you know, there's a build-up here of a much more, nearly mythical, epic quality, if you like.
The poem explodes.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, brink is a Cold War word, right?
Yeah,
and here it's used, as Caroline just said, as an aesthetic strategy. Okay, we're at the brink, and now we just explode with everything.
Yeah.
And this is Sawako in her surrealistic mode. At her best. It's also Dylan in his own. He didn't do a lot of surrealism, but this is one of those.
Well, and there's also this interesting traversal that happens, like to Bethany's point about this sort of syntactic culmination of like you're on a train and then you're going through these clauses and this kind of like it sounds like a train passing by. You are carried away with this final sentence, even to the point of training up for the hard rain. You go from this place to this verb, to an action, and that training could be one of two things. You could be training to a place, or you could be training up for an end goal. You could be a soldier, or you could be a passenger.
The idiom here, training up, is significant. Training up for the hard rain. Yeah.
And that for me, because of the Dylan song, it has that post-apocalyptic moment, and that's what the new weather is, and the dead oceans, of course. If we didn't know, then you know, you get it there basically.
And that's the new weather.
And that's the new weather. Yeah.
That's
so
frightening.
it's so much
That's
grittier
very
and surreal and frightening than a rainbow, right, from the Dylan song that
Absolutely.
the girl is offering.
I think in the Dylan song, that I think of it, the rainbow is a suggestion that at some point the sun will rise and, you know, a few people will have survived. And, you know, well, my son, you might be one of them. You know, I'll be gone, but you might be one of them. Sawako doesn't have any such false hope or real hope.
No, we have broken tongue talkers. We have this diaspora that comes out of this cataclysm.
Wow. And so It Happens is classic early 1960s brinkmanship language. When it happens, so that would be the nuclear explosion or something like that. And this puts me in mind, at least, of the now Dylan's song predates this, but the 1964 presidential campaign where the Johnson team, the advertisers, put out making us scared of Goldwater by having a little girl holding a flower in a field, maybe a field from one of the other poems, standing there, and then you get the mushroom cloud, right? This is a sort of unfair, famous thing. So all we had to do was think, oh, the innocent girls, the abstract A and D of our world will be deprived of their innocence by some idiot. If you vote for Goldwater, this is what's going to happen. I mean, there is a reflection of that nervousness.
I think because, again, of that drastic break, which is also syntactically broken in the change of rhythm, and the insouciance of just throwing peanuts, eating peanuts, you know, like stuff you do when you're bored, you know, on the train, and then suddenly, boom, you know, okay.
That's the
that
one
was
moment
something
when
else.
all parents remember the word insouciant in describing you insouciant children. Stop hurting these other people. There's the guy with a toupee with a peanut sticking out of the top of it. Come on, kids.
Don't be
you know?
insouciant.
It's the very definition of it.
Fantastic word.
But so Henry, back
Carefree
to
would be-
comedy. I
carefree
mean,
might be a better
this is
word.
a devastating poem
It is.
about a loss
It
of
is.
innocence, but it's
Yeah.
also funny in a way. The peanut war at the beginning
Yeah.
is
It's
funny.
it's sweet. It's like I feel like there's something really moving to me about the title. Even Girl A's peanuts and Girl D's mouthful. Like it's this shared
they're
thing.
actually
One is possibility and
They're
one
throwing
is the
nuts
thing.
into
At
each other's
other's,
mouth. I
yeah.
forgot to mention that
Yeah.
scene. That's
Yeah.
a game.
Yeah, it
and
is.
mostly they miss, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course. So
And
that's
it
why all
goes into the guy's toupee.
exactly.
Well,
Exactly.
and I just like this, like the expectancy, the sort of the innocence of yearning
Yeah.
in that, like,
Yeah.
like Girl D is waiting for this really sweet act by a friend.
Yes. So, Bethany Swan, I have to have you on every Poem Talk because you delivered a random order and it worked because now we're about to get probably the most difficult of the poems. But before we do that, let's go around and just say in a word or a phrase or a sentence what Sawako Nakayasu's stance, posture, tone, attitude. You know, some of us have read all the girl poems in this book. Even if we've just done these 4, you must have a thought about her disposition at this point in this project. And Henry's not sure because I could tell by his face. So Bethany, you first.
I like how bold and unapologetic it is.
Bold and unapologetic.
Yeah.
Great.
I think it's both playful and very dark or playful, and at the same time harsh. It's consumerist and it is political. It has a balancing. It's a sort of neutralized tone in a lot of the syntax and the punctuation, and at the same time, some of the stories, like we've just seen, are really sort of shocking and disturbing. So there's
Henry?
I really love the neutralized tone because I think that gives it an almost like anthropological remove or sociological, socially scientific remove, but then it's paired with these really, I think, like angry and violent, like incisive, like observations that are really just gripping. I think that it's angry and it is also amused and maybe even bemused.
I think I would add, I don't think this differs from what you all are saying, but I would add playfully controlling or in control. There's a lot of ha Sawako deus ex machina here. Like, just then, a water gun drops from the ceiling. What? Oh, a water gun in a poem about guns, gun control. Oh, Sawako, you know how to drop tools into it. I mean, she's totally in charge of these off-the-rails seeming ditties. It's kind of an amazing combination, I would say. Okay, the last poem we're going to talk about, 10 Girls in a Bag of Potato Chips. This is actually quite typical of many poems in the book. What the hell? Okay, Henry, the last time, set up the scene. This time I'm going to ask you to set up the scene if you possibly can. Are there actually girls in a bag of potato chips?
It seems like there are 10 girls who are fighting over the chips inside of a bag.
That's
it does
it, right?
indeed. Yeah, that's all. We can just back it up and go home. That's all there is.
And I love no, not yet. I'm enjoying this too much. I mean the bag that they reside in. So the commas, the container comma, I mean the bag comma that they reside in. You would never use a that clause there unless you were being really funny. You know, I told you they were actually in the bag, so I'm going to separate it by commas.
Yeah, so she wants to make sure that we've got the title. It's in a bag.
It's amazing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay.
Well, and this also feels like one of the only ones that we've
Yeah, you're
read
right, that's
that
separated.
where the title is part of the poem. That's the first line, and it runs directly into 10 Girls in
Oh,
a Bag
right.
of Potato
Okay.
Chips.
The verb
Fight
verb
over who
form.
gets the
Fight
chip.
over.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good. Yeah. Okay, so it's silly, more peanut games, right? We fight over who gets the chip, and I like the round and perfect ones, and you like the... So what more is it then, Bethany? It's more than that, right?
I think there's always more with Sawako. So what really fascinated me was the way that we get to the final stanza with girl H, who is so astute and is very, very much aware of what consumption means and her own position, her own complex position in the global supply chain to consumption. And then this last line, she has trouble deciding whether to speak, slap, or remain silent. As the final line, I feel like that gets kind of turned to us as the listeners who also have this choice, right? To speak, to act out, or to remain silent. And so for me, there was this kind of like tautological moment there.
Caroline?
I was looking at the use of comparatives, so more, no more, and then more than, and then bigger, rounder, better, or more imperfect, less round. This sort of detail. I mean, why spend all this time on the comparing chips and so again, very much sitting with what you said about the global economy, and then also comparing beings, like are you more round, more, perfect, more imperfect? So I thought that use of the comparative here was really very interesting, actually.
Well, yeah, and it kind of, to that point, it almost sets up this way of like, how are we defined by what we consume? Or in this case, that what we consume is also that which we are consumed by. Like we're trapped in the bag, and only Girl H is the one who has the political consciousness of being aware of the bag. Everyone else is fighting over its contents.
And what is their collective fate? I mean, all the poems in this book have something directly or indirectly to say about what's going to happen to these girls.
I think they get eaten by the big monster at the end of the Inferno, Dante's Inferno, like the illustration by, the very famous one, the French one, where it's basically this monstrous face at the end of the Inferno. And it's also with an open mouth. So I feel they get eaten by the situation of the global food supply. But if you want to stay with this sort of slightly cartoony stuff and surreal that we've identified with her, I just had this idea of this big, figure that is going to open the bag and eat all the girls and eat all the, as well as the chips.
So the parable is, Caroline, it's... okay, we spend a lot of our innocent effort picking out, that's the best chip, and this is the kind of chip that I like, and I want that chip, you can have that chip. But in the end, we aren't consuming, what we consume is nothing compared to our being consumed by larger systems. Wow, if that's it. Oh, my God.
I mean, collective fate, the outcome, the likely
phrase.
Outcome of the collective fate, you are in a bag of chips. You can be the observer like Girl H, who still has some kind of a sense of, hang on, I'm a thinking being here. I don't want to eat a chip, and I don't want to be eaten either. But she's wondering, how can she get out of this predicament that she finds herself in? And she doesn't even know, should she speak, what should she do? So I don't know. Yeah, for me, there was that sense of this other story that I'm building up, of course, but that I could feel growing as I was reading this piece.
I really appreciate that. I think the conversation about the aesthetics in the second stanza, about what you're saying, the comparative nature of, which girl is choosing the bigger, rounder chip versus the one that is sharper. And is that also a comparison about poetry, do you think? Is there something that is parabolic in the way that Sawako is sort of not necessarily like indicting the poetry community, but is pointing out the relation between poetry and aesthetics, and then also consumerism and supply chains and institutions and, neoliberalism? Is that there too, or is that kind of like...
I think it's absolutely there. I mean, I think that's... I love that point, because it's very much like when people become so subsumed with the aesthetics of their politics that it's less about the actual systems that remain in control and remain oppressing them. It's no, we disagree about the utility of this chip. We are fighting over who gets which chip, as though there are no more than 10 chips in this bag, but there are always more than 10 chips in the bag. And it's like girl H is the one who would pull back and is like, whoa, there's enough chips, but what about this bag?
Right.
For the first time, I get this feeling that there is a girl, H. I'm not sure how H gets us to Sawako Nakayasu, but I feel like H is a cousin of Sawako, or maybe is Sawako a portrait of the artist as a young girl, H. You know, I'm feeling like Sawako is there, and I think you all are right. Sawako's the one peeking out from the potato chip bag saying, this doesn't have to be. Oops. Gulp. Yum, 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 yum. That's the Dante-esque. I just did a Sesame Street version of Dante's monster. Caroline Bergvall, you think more than anybody I know about translation and about collegial and communitarian translation. This poem is one of those that was translated post facto by colleagues, one translating into French and one Japanese. What's the significance of that? What does it mean? You, native to French, probably followed that French translation. I don't know if you have any comment on it. The floor is yours to talk about the importance of translation
Great.
to Sawako and to you.
Absolutely. In her work, so important also as a translator. And so the fact that she chooses to place translation throughout the volume as part of, in equal footing as all the pieces in English, that she uses French as well as Japanese. So just basically goes quite openly to different language sources. I thought all that for me is sort of so representative of Sawako's own practice anyway. So for me to see that in the book was just great. I was really very excited by it. And indeed very excited by all the poems that I can't read. And so when we...
Can you say more about that? You get to the Japanese poem.
I get
I'm
to the
assuming you don't read
Japanese...
Japanese.
So I get to the Japanese poem that I can't read, and then I sort of... so I then start looking at it, and I'm not... Let me see, what page is that? 67? No, the Japanese, 82, thank you. So I found myself in front of that poem, and I can't read it. I discern that it's Japanese, and then I look for what I could potentially look for. So initially, you see, I didn't realize there was an index. So when I was reading the book the very first time, I would go, oh, hang on, so there's a gap here. So where are the poems with the gaps? You know, I was trying to piece it together visually. And here you have 10, 10, A, 10, H. So suddenly I've got quite a lot to go on here, you know, like there's 5 elements that allow me to at least go down the page. And then the paragraph breaks that initially when I didn't know it was, you know, which poem it was, I didn't know the index, I could then refer back to. And there's G as well. So here I have, and there's C. In fact, as I'm describing
C
it like
for
that.
the identification of
Here
which
you
girl.
have the
yes.
girls and the numbers coming up. So that's really exciting because there's a bit of action then going on. I don't know what it is, but there's numbers and there's figures, or there's numbers and there's letters. And because I'm in the context of the book, I know they are figures. What they do, I don't know. But I have just about information to know that I'm talking about there's 10 of something and then there's 4 figures, one or another, that are flagged up.
This
so
is
that's the
so
beginning
you.
of, you know.
This is so you. Because you're in so much of your work, you're saying, look, I am not going to wait till the moment when I have a full command of this other language I don't understand, this text that I am going to work with it. I'm going to try and hear the homonyms and the false friends, and I'm going to do what I can. That's so you. This is a little further afield than a language that you use, but
yeah.
Old English is hard for you, and you navigate it. And that's one of the reasons this work is appealing to you?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's very exciting. And for me, it's always about the limitation of one's own, you know, language is what we know. And so not to be able to handle or to know how to read, but to see that it's a writing system, which is the Japanese. For me, that is, like I said, very exciting. It shows me the limits. In fact, she uses the word limits in the other poem we saw earlier. The limits of my own knowing, the limits of my own languages, and I think that's really so. Yeah. I'm in the middle of a book, and I just have to accept that limit. Now that is very appropriate to the poems actually as well that we're looking at, because they remain quite elusive, don't they? They have these cartoony sort of ways of writing a story, but actually there's so much we don't know, and so in a way, this is the more extreme representation of that.
And when we picked this one, I can't remember if it was my asking Sawako via your interest to ask Chow and Ozawa to record, because they recorded this for the first time. They hadn't done this. They wrote it, and they hadn't meant to. And she contacted them, and immediately when she sent us the sound files, they were there. And that suggests what about what she's trying to achieve here? A community project, a transnational, translinguistic project.
Definitely, and a sense of complicity, that they are wishing to be part of. They want to take that one step further. Well, that would be my quick response to it, which might fit well with all these unidentified girl A, B, C, D, E, the alphabet of girls, as well. So.
Yeah. Okay, let's go around and give final thoughts, because we could go on for a long time. There's so much more to say about these 4 poems and others, but what did you come today wanting to say but haven't had a chance to yet about any of these poems? And you're all looking down, so I take it you're not ready. Bethany, what's your final thought?
Wow, I just feel like I'm so in awe of what Sawako does, and I'm still thinking about what you just said, Elle, in that these poems enact collaboration through translation, and what you shared, Caroline, in that they are asking people to come together and also, like, what does it mean to have, like, that phrase, like, command of a language? It's so colonizing, like, it's so awful. And so thinking about what language actually is, and the way that poetry has always tried to kind of just sort of, like, pierce through that idea that there exists some sort of authoritative command of language. And so I really like thinking about the whimsical, lighthearted, and yet the kind of like gravity and terror that Sawako invokes in this collection.
Fantastic. Thank you. Henry, final thought?
Wow. Thank you, Bethany. That was like extremely well said. I think that what am I trying to say? I really, really love how Sawako just by just inserting untranslated text into her work sort of invites me as a reader to think about community and like the larger sort of linguistic community as one that like should be heterogeneous, that should like embrace difference, and that like just like these anonymized girls who I can't really ever truly know. I may not ever truly be able to read Japanese or to understand French, but that I can sit with those poems in a book side by side with ones written in a language that I understand and sort of have the experience of that work all the same. And sort of like, I feel like it's an invitation to sit with another that you may not have a full understanding of, and to like sit in like community and humor and terror. And I think it's really beautiful.
And you're okay with that with the same spirit that Caroline was talking about.
Absolutely,
with respect to with the languages that you don't know.
Well, and to search for things that I can know. Like, I think that active sort of reading that we just saw you do is really amazing, because it shows that like, it's just saying I don't know can be just such a cop-out, because have you really looked? And I think that Sawako really wants you to look.
But she's not going to lead you by the faux Socratic nose.
No, she's not.
Seeing something that she sees. In fact, she will listen to this, I'm guessing, and just have a great time enjoying some stuff we did with these poems that she probably hadn't even thought of. Right? And will not write a nasty letter saying, "Dear PoemTalk, you people don't know what you're talking about." Not at all, right?
Yeah.
Not at all.
I think that sits with the playfulness. There's a sense of really, I have to say, with all these small stories we've been sort of going through, there is a sense of the pleasure of telling stories. There is a little bit of that sort of joyous way of the reader. These are written for readers, and I have to say I really love having heard them spoken out. For me, that made them really come through. So that I thought immediately more about this is nearly small fables or stories, if you like. So I really enjoyed that. So it brings it into a slightly different category, which is the poetics that are also about the communal that you were describing. Because if there are stories that are meant to be told, then we are expecting a reader. So suddenly I realize, and perhaps with these as well, readers are invited and expected and hoped for, and all listeners in here, through the form itself.
I knew that the three of you each would be able to just say a stream of really smart and brilliant and thoughtful and sensitive things about this work. But Sawako, so we could have done this with, The Charge of the Light Brigade, I think, or whatever, or some Robert Frost poem. But the fact is that it was Sawako that engendered this collaborative improvisational genius that the three of you have exhibited. I'll throw myself in there too.
Definitely.
The four of us. So that's why we like poets. I forget the poems for a second. The poets who can make us spend an hour. Granted, the camera's rolling and the mics are in front of us and we have to do stuff. But given that structure, it's just fascinating how Sawako engendered that. So my final thought has something to do with that. I am kind of obsessed with the failure of the ut pictura poesis tradition in Girl in the Field of Flowers, the poem that's about a painting, or the poem that's about a painting, which is about poems about the painting. That whole tradition actually is said to be something of a failure here because the tradition of close looking, which is a cousin to the tradition of close reading, which is what we're doing, though, gingerly, it all gets thrown into this problem, which is ultimately, I think, a scene of something really terrible that has happened. Something terrible happened to that girl. Why are the clothes crumpled? There's the grass and flowers seem to be depressed and flattened. There may have been two bodies there. There's something really, really dark that's happened there. And close reading doesn't get to it. And close looking, even led by the nose, you're not necessarily seeing it. And so I feel indicted. The very thing that we're doing, much as I congratulated us, the very thing we're doing is what else? What else do you see? Henry, what else do you see? Bethany, what else do you see? I'm the what else guy. So I need to back off from that when chastened by all these flattened flowers that we leave behind. We need to be slower and more, to use a favorite word of yours, we need to be slower and to maybe let the flowers stand and not flatten them. Yeah. And I don't think we've done that because we picked 4 poems rather than 1. We really would have flattened it if it was just 1.
But what you're pointing out, which we hadn't talked about at all, is, of course, the potential for rape or sexual violence that has happened here that is flattening. I think that's what's there. Yeah. And this is something that we didn't point out at all in the first go-through of the poem. Also, you were pointing out flatten a lot. You could see the violence, but the way you're putting it, for me, suddenly I'm going, oh my God, that's the darkness of that poem. And we sort of and that's also the darkness of art history, and we sort of sail through that one. And so I really appreciate that you take us back there, and suddenly there's that, but this one is really big. Well,
it's almost like the way that we're desensitized to images of violence every day.
Well, because we're just reading a fucking painting, and we're watching a teacher, which we are, maybe on our worst days, maybe on our best days, leading people to see what we've seen for 30 years. I have shown you this Manet. Is it a Manet, did you say?
Yeah, it is, yeah.
I've shown this Manet at noon with the lights.
It is a Manet, for sure.
I've shown you this painting, the lights out, in an art history tiered classroom for 35 years, and now you will see what I see, and I'm going to lead you to it so that you feel the liberation of having come upon an art historical interpretation. And you know what? Even after 35 years, I miss the fact that a crime has been committed, and it may or may not be a narrative crime of what happened to a girl. It is the crime of having a painting that after all these years you still can't see because you've been trained to do it a certain way. Well, we like to end Poem Talk with a minute or two of Gathering Paradise, which is a chance for several of us, or if you're quick, all of us, to spread wide our narrow Dickinsonian hands to gather a little something really poetically or cinematographically or aesthetically good, to hail or commend someone or something going on in the world of art that you want to recommend Bethany Swan, you got something?
Okay, so I would recommend any film by Paolo Sorrentino, who's a director who I love. And I've been watching The Young Pope on HBO.
Really? You've been watching The Young Pope?
and
But you're not
very
recommending
much
that, are you?
enjoying it. Yes. So I'm also a divinity student, and so I love thinking about theology and like the kind of like tussles that Catholicism gets into. But I really enjoy the cinematography of Paolo and the vision. And so my favorite ever film is The Great Beauty. And so if you've seen that, just the juxtapositions, it is like cinematic poetry. So
Thank you, Bethany. Great recommendation. Henry, top that.
I don't think I can, but I can hardly recommend, I guess, a streaming show that me and my husband have been watching recently. Severance on Apple TV Plus is this really kind of amazing and surreal, almost sci-fi, but never quite like explicitly like science fiction, about like what if you had the opportunity to sever your work life from your real life, and sort of really in like unflinchingly looks at like the existential horror that might cause for the person who only exists at work, and what it means to be responsible for creating a new consciousness without their consent. It's very good. It's also inexplicably directed by Ben Stiller.
Inexplicably meaning, where did he get that?
Where the hell did this come from? Because it's darkly funny, but it's also very moving and very well done.
Are you and Josh coming to a new consciousness as a result of watching this? Is that in the offing?
I
You
think
don't have to answer that
it's a
question.
little more confirming what I already supposed about what work can do to a body, but
You've been thinking a lot about what work can do.
I have.
Okay, congratulations on getting the end of the work and the beginning of Severance.
Yes, thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. Caroline Bergvall. By the way, can I just say that you're paradise. You are paradise. We're gathering
thank
paradise,
you.
and you are paradise.
Oh, well,
Enough said.
It's been amazing to me, heaven to me. So
You made a Dante reference, so gathering paradise.
I would like to recommend a fantastic anthology which came out, I believe, in lockdown. Queen's English came out with Roof Books, edited by Q Lee. I think Sawako has a piece in there as well. It's subtitled Poetry, Performativity, and Translation, Poetry, Philosophy, and Performativity. And it is an amazing mix of poets and thinkers, cross languages, cross forms, cross genres, all so riffing off this idea of the Queen's English. Is it the Queen? Is it the Queen's? Is it the Queen's English? And that's just the beginning of it. It's a wonderful, very dynamic anthology that I really warmly recommend.
And although Q is spelled Kyoo, Q goes by Q, the letter Q. So there's
That's
a
right.
queen.
There you have
There's a queen as well.
Exactly. And
And Q is the queen of philosophy, let's face it. Well, thank you. My Gathering Paradise is, as I mentioned, Caroline Bergvall, a new book. Well, I'm going to say new, even though it's 2019, but in pandemic times, new. Alisoun Sings, which is an effort by someone named Caroline, figure in the book, and Caroline sitting to my left as well, of course, to reckon with, to allow to speak, to engage, and to reinvent the Wife of Bath of Chaucer. And I would like to cede my couple of seconds over to Caroline herself and ask her to read a few lines marked out in a section of the book which is sincere, unironic, and ecstatic, or positive anyway, called Declaration. Would you be willing?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Oh, this bit, yeah, okay. Reject the narrowness with which we are intended, its accepted forms of shame and expectations. Let free our beings from hardened limitations, engage dreams, bolster tender tentacular realities. Courage grows when grown from love's justice. Upcall, personate its wisdom vastness. Pleasure's hard to achieve beyond karma technique. 'Tis a life's work to share and comprehend as a click. So do axe again how things uncross, how fear and sadness can be unknotted. Axe what creates, connects, what brought together, interwoven cellularly, inseparate, like tongues in a cos. Or let me put it this way. What is somebody moved to the sign of a larger future? Collectivized without sacrifice, feminized without fear, all shades and gradations freely be lit and animated. Like I said, pump up the V, don't believe the tag, mind's opulent, compost poesy, big up, historicize.
Big up, historicize. Historicize
really-
is spelled H-Y, historicize. What were you going to say?
It was really pleasurable to be reading this on the back of our conversation and feeling some aspects of Sawako's project that I could recognize as well in ways of trying to rethink, but potentially this idea of the larger or another future, hopefully, potentially.
So in Gathering Paradise, we again realize a certain cousin or sisterly relationship to Sawako, and that's one of the reasons why it was so good and wise for you to select that we would talk about Sawako, since you co-curated this, and I wanted to acknowledge that. I'm going to ask Zach, as I wrap up, to end this not with the usual PoemTalk theme song, but with Dylan's Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, and I know it's going to be hard because we're going to have a permissions problem, but he'll figure it out. So that is all the training up for the hard rain we have time for on PoemTalk today. PoemTalk at the Writers' House is a collaboration of the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing and the Kelly Writers' House at the University of Pennsylvania and the Poetry Foundation, poetryfoundation.org. Thanks so, so much to my guests. Bethany Swan, you are such a champ. This was a great first time. I hope you'll do it again.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and Henry Steinberg, welcome back to your second home.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
And the glorious, eminent Caroline Bergvall. Thank you so much, Caroline.
Thank you so much.
And to PoemTalk's director and engineer today, Zach Cardner. And to PoemTalk's editor, the same amazing, generous, and talented Zach Cardner. And a shout out to Nathan and Elizabeth Light for their very generous support of PoemTalk. Next time on PoemTalk, we'll be on the road once again, this time to the beautiful Hudson River Valley on the campus of Bard College in, I think the town's called Annandale-on-Hudson, on the river's mid-state east bank, where we will be talking with Lainey Brown, Erica Kaufman, and Joan Ritalik about a passage from Joan's remarkable work, The Poetical Wager. This is Al Filreis, and I hope you'll join us next month for that, or another episode of PoemTalk.